Folks frequently approach me and ask how on earth I manage to retain so much information. They operate under the assumption that I possess some secret trick, some highly guarded mental system that I utilize to file away all these intricate equations, scientific principles, and complex ideas securely inside my brain. And to be perfectly honest with you, the reality is that I don't actually remember the vast majority of it, at least not in the traditional way that they imagine I do. When I was just a young university student navigating the halls of MIT, I would routinely observe my fellow classmates staying awake entirely through the night, right before major exams, frantically attempting to cram mathematical formulas directly into their skulls. They would meticulously ink equations onto their palms and wrists, repeating the same sequences over and over again in a desperate loop, and nervously testing one another as they paced up and down the dormitory hallways. Then, the following morning, they would march directly into that sterile examination room, looking exactly like terrified soldiers heading straight onto a battlefield, desperately praying that not a single piece of data would accidentally slip out of their short-term memory before they had the chance to frantically scribble it down onto their test papers. Yet, if you were to approach those exact same students just one short week later and ask them the exact same questions they had just been tested on, they would stare right back at you with completely blank, vacant expressions. The information was entirely gone, completely evaporated into thin air, exactly as if they had never even attempted to learn the material in the first place. I vividly recall one specific, incredibly stressful examination period during my junior year focused on advanced calculus. The young man sitting directly beside me was an absolutely brilliant individual, someone who undoubtedly worked significantly harder than anyone else I knew at the time. He had dedicated 2 solid weeks to obsessively memorizing complex mathematical theorems and intricate geometric proofs. He utilized massive stacks of flashcards, organized elaborate group study sessions, and did absolutely everything by the book. I would constantly spot him huddled in the corner of the campus library at the stroke of midnight, quietly muttering complicated formulas to himself under his breath. However, when the actual day of the exam finally arrived, he completely froze up. He was able to recall the very first line of a specific proof, but his mind completely blanked on where the logic proceeded from there. He vaguely knew that a certain theorem was supposed to be applied to the problem, but he found himself entirely unable to mentally retrieve its precise, exact phrasing. He had effectively constructed an incredibly fragile house of cards within his mind, and the very moment that a single, solitary card slipped out of place, the entire foundational structure came crashing down around him. Fast forward roughly 6 months later, and purely out of my own intellectual curiosity, I casually asked him about one of those exact same theorems. I was genuinely wondering how he might approach a unique mathematical problem I was currently wrestling with. He simply looked at me as though I had just started speaking to him in a completely foreign language. Every single ounce of that knowledge had vanished. I operated quite differently, although, to be completely transparent, I did not actually realize my methods were unusual at the time. I simply couldn't help myself. It was just how my brain functioned. You see, I possessed this relentless, burning problem. I harbored a deep-seated need to fully comprehend exactly where things originated from. I wasn't satisfied just knowing what things were. I aggressively needed to understand why they were the way they were, and that subtle shift in perspective changed absolutely everything for me. Let me provide you with a concrete illustration of exactly what I mean. During my sophomore year of college, our class was diving into Maxwell's equations. These are genuinely beautiful, profound concepts, essentially 4 distinct mathematical statements that flawlessly describe the entirety of electricity and magnetism. My peers would diligently write them out on their notepads, stare blankly at the symbols, and attempt to forcefully burn the characters into their visual memory. But I found myself fundamentally incapable of doing that. I would stare at just one of those complex equations, and I would immediately start wondering, why on earth does it look exactly like that? Where in the world did James Clerk Maxwell actually derive this from? Consequently, I would be forced to work entirely backward, painstakingly tracing the logical reasoning step by step, until I could vividly visualize the entire developmental path, starting all the way from rudimentary, simple experiments involving basic magnets and copper wires, progressing all the way up to this incredibly elegant, sophisticated mathematical statement. It took significantly longer, often astronomically longer. There were times I would consume an entire evening just attempting to deeply comprehend a single equation, while my roommate easily memorized all four of them in an hour and promptly went to sleep. He would constantly shake his head at me in disbelief, lecturing me that I was foolishly wasting precious time, reminding me that we had a massive exam in exactly 3 days, and criticizing me for still fiddling around with the foundational basics. But here's the magnificent secret. I never once forgot those equations. This wasn't because I happened to possess a photographic memory, but strictly because I never actually attempted to memorize them in the first place. I genuinely, deeply understood them. And let me tell you, there is an absolute universe of difference separating those two concepts. You see, human memory is an incredibly peculiar phenomenon. We generally tend to conceptualize it as being similar to a massive metal filing cabinet, where you meticulously tuck pieces of information away into folders, crossing your fingers and hoping you can somehow locate them again when the moment demands it. But that is absolutely not how the brain actually functions. Authentic memory, the specific variety that truly lasts a lifetime, the kind that proves deeply useful, is not a system of storage whatsoever. It is a process of active reconstruction. When you recall something, you are not simply pulling out a dusty file from a drawer. You are organically rebuilding the entire concept from foundational pieces that you already genuinely understand. Take a brief moment to reflect on your own daily life. You instinctively know the precise route to get to your best friend's house, correct? But when you drive there, you are absolutely not mentally reading off a rigid bulleted list of GPS instructions telling yourself to turn left at the 3rd Street intersection, proceed forward for exactly 0.4 miles, and then execute a right turn. Absolutely not. What you actually remember are the physical landmarks, the spatial feelings, the underlying logic of the geographical route. You recall passing that massive, sprawling oak tree. You look out for the bright yellow house sitting on the corner, and you rely on the general geographic awareness that you are continually heading in the direction of the river. And relying entirely on those fragmented, understood pieces, you successfully reconstruct the correct pathway every single time you make the journey. You quite literally couldn't forget that route, even if you actively attempted to, primarily because you aren't merely storing rigid data. You are understanding a spatial relationship. Or, let us ponder an even simpler, more mundane example. You fundamentally know how to prepare a hot cup of coffee, right? Yet, you have never once sat down with flashcards to memorize the sequential steps. You absolutely do not stand in your kitchen reciting a robotic script. Step 1. Fill the metal kettle. Step 2. Bring the water to a rolling boil. Step 3. Place the roasted coffee grounds into the ceramic cup. Instead, you simply grasp the underlying logic of the entire operation. You need highly heated water, you need crushed coffee beans, and you need to thoroughly mix them together. The precise, exact sequence of your actions naturally emerges directly from your fundamental understanding of the ultimate goal you are attempting to achieve. And because you possess a firm grasp of the core purpose, which is extracting the rich, complex flavors from the coffee grounds utilizing thermal energy, you become highly adaptable. If you suddenly realize you don't possess a kettle, you effortlessly pivot and use a cooking pot. If you lack a standard coffee cup, you comfortably substitute a large travel mug. Genuine understanding is inherently flexible and highly adaptable. Rote memorization, on the other hand, is dangerously rigid and incredibly brittle. That exact framework is precisely what I trained myself to do with the field of physics. And subsequently, with absolutely every single topic I ever harbored a desire to truly master, I actively stopped attempting to simply remember facts. Instead, I poured my energy into trying to comprehend the material so profoundly, so deeply, that the very concept of forgetting it became a literal impossibility. Let me share a highly practical, real-world example drawn directly from my own professional career. During the height of the war, I was stationed at Los Alamos, and we were heavily tasked with executing some intensely complex mathematical calculations for the atomic bomb initiative. It was a truly horrifying creation, to be perfectly frank. But that is an entirely different narrative for another day. The core point is this: we were constantly faced with incredibly complicated, highly nasty integrals to solve. hideous mathematical beasts that would routinely demand pages upon pages of dense, tedious algebra to successfully work your way through. My highly educated colleagues would meticulously solve these equations once, very carefully document every single algebraic step in their personal notebooks, and then rigidly refer back to those exact same notebooks whenever they required that specific mathematical result in the future. I, however, tackled the issue completely differently. Every single time I discovered I needed the answer to one of those complex integrals, I would sit down and aggressively solve it completely from scratch all over again. People around the lab genuinely thought I had lost my mind. "You literally just finished doing this precise calculation last week," they would say in utter exasperation. "Just open your notes and look at the answer." But I stubbornly refused to do that. I would force myself to work through the entire grueling process yet again. And what I found was that, quite frequently, I would discover an entirely different logical pathway, a significantly cleaner, more elegant method to arrive at the exact same conclusion. And then, after a certain period of time, something wonderfully strange began to happen. These highly complex solutions that originally demanded a full, agonizing hour to complete the very first time I tackled them would suddenly only require 20 minutes. Then that duration dropped to 10 minutes. And finally, a mere 5 minutes. This incredible speed was not occurring because I was successfully memorizing the specific sequence of algebraic steps, but entirely because I was finally understanding the deep, underlying structure of the math. I was beginning to clearly perceive the invisible patterns operating beneath the surface of the numbers. I organically began to recognize exactly when a certain mathematical substitution would prove effective. Not because I had memorized a rigid textbook rule stating to use a specific substitution for a specific type of problem, but because I could literally feel the innate way the equations inherently wanted to shift and move. I know it sounds somewhat abstract and difficult to explain, but it is strikingly similar to understanding how to dance. When you dance beautifully, you are not mentally counting and remembering a strict sequence of foot placements. You organically feel the rhythm of the music. You connect with the melody, and your physical body simply knows exactly what it needs to do. There was one specific integral in particular, a genuinely nasty, horrific equation, heavily involving complex exponentials and oscillating mathematical functions, that continuously kept popping up across several different theoretical contexts. The very first time I attempted to solve it, the agonizing process consumed the vast majority of my afternoon. There were countless false starts, endless attempts at integration by parts, and a desperate reliance on clever mathematical tricks. The second time that specific integral appeared on my desk, I purposefully started with a completely fresh blank page once again. On this iteration, I managed to uncover a slightly different analytical approach, and the entire process only consumed roughly 1 hour of my time. The third time I faced it, I suddenly perceived a beautiful hidden symmetry within the equation that I had entirely overlooked before, and the entire monstrous problem rapidly collapsed down into something remarkably simple and elegant. By the time I reached the 10th repetition, I could practically write down the final answer instantly without thinking, but I assure you, it was absolutely not because I had rotely memorized the sequence. I had simply internalized the structural anatomy of the problem so incredibly deeply that actively solving it felt identically as effortless as casually answering the question, "What is 2 plus 2?" The human brain is a truly remarkable, breathtaking instrument when it comes to pattern recognition. We are evolutionarily built specifically for that purpose. We effortlessly spot faces hidden in the shapes of fluffy clouds. We distinctly hear spoken words buried within random static noise, and we aggressively seek out meaning hidden deep within absolute chaos. That is our species' greatest intellectual gift. But we tragically waste that incredible potential whenever we attempt to utilize our minds exactly as if they were digital computers, desperately trying to store raw, uncontextualized data on a hard drive. Computers are incredibly wonderful at executing that specific task. Human beings are terrible at it. What we are genuinely wonderful at, however, is uncovering hidden connections, recognizing broad relationships, and weaving together massive, intricate webs of conceptual meaning. Therefore, here is the ultimate revelation I discovered. If you harbor a genuine desire to remember a concept for the rest of your natural life, You must actively stop trying to simply remember it. Instead, you must aggressively connect it to concepts and ideas that you already thoroughly understand. You must integrate it into your pre-existing web of knowledge so deeply and so thoroughly that it quite literally transforms into a fundamental component of exactly how you think about the world. For example, when I first set out to learn the field of quantum mechanics, and I mean truly authentically learn it, not merely memorize the textbook formulas to pass an exam, I dedicated months upon months simply playing around with elementary, conceptual toy problems. I focused entirely on incredibly simple systems, scenarios drastically simpler than anything a professor would ever place on a genuine university exam. I studied a theoretical particle trapped inside a box, or the mechanics of a simple harmonic oscillator. I would relentlessly solve those exact same basic problems from absolutely every single angle and perspective I could possibly conceptualize. I would sketch out detailed visual drawings. I would construct elaborate real-world analogies. And I would desperately attempt to explain the complex concepts aloud to myself, utilizing nothing but the plainest, most basic English possible. And very slowly, step by step, those abstract principles organically evolved into a core part of my being. They ceased being sterile facts that I had to remember. They blossomed into entirely new ways of thinking that I had completely absorbed. I vividly recall lying completely awake in my bed one late night, absolutely unable to drift off to sleep because my brain was obsessively chewing on the concept of the uncertainty principle. I was not focused on the mathematical formula. Any fool can memorize a string of symbols, but rather, I was agonizing over what the principle actually signifies regarding physical reality. I envisioned the exact process of attempting to physically measure the precise location of a tiny electron. To actually see it, you fundamentally require a photon of light. However, light possesses its own physical momentum, and the very microsecond that light forcefully collides with the electron to reveal its position, it physically imparts a violent kick to it. Consequently, the more intensely and precisely you attempt to pin down the exact position, the significantly larger the resulting kick becomes, meaning the more entirely uncertain the electron's momentum simultaneously becomes. I suddenly realized that this is not merely a frustrating limitation of our primitive scientific instruments. It is a fundamental law hardwired directly into the very fabric of physical reality itself. Position and momentum are ultimately just complementary methods of attempting to describe the exact same physical entity, and the universe dictates that you fundamentally cannot possess a perfect measurement of both simultaneously. The absolute moment that I truly felt that reality, not just intellectually acknowledged it, but deeply, intuitively felt it in my bones, I knew I could never possibly forget it. It permanently became a crucial lens through which I view the entire universe. Because of these experiences, there is a specific rigorous test that I have always utilized, and I highly recommend it to absolutely anyone who genuinely desires to truly know a subject. I personally refer to it as the Explain It Simply test. The mechanics of it are quite straightforward. After you sit down and convince yourself that you have successfully learned a new topic, immediately attempt to explain it to a theoretical person who has zero background knowledge on the subject. However, you are strictly forbidden from utilizing any of the fancy technical jargon you just read in the textbook. You are not allowed to merely parrot back the exact phrasing your professor used during the lecture. You must articulate the entire concept entirely in your own original words, leaning heavily on everyday relatable analogies and incredibly simple, accessible language. If you find yourself stuttering and failing to accomplish this task, the harsh reality is that you do not actually understand the material. Not genuinely. You have merely memorized a highly sophisticated academic way of speaking about it. And let me assure you, that is precisely the intellectual trap that ensnares so many incredibly bright, highly educated individuals. They dedicate their energy to mastering the specific vocabulary of a given field. They train themselves to deploy the correct sophisticated words in the exactly correct grammatical order. And they tragically mistake that surface-level verbal fluency for deep structural understanding. But I promise you, those two things are absolutely not the same thing at all. I clearly remember the exact period when I was initially studying the complex concepts of entropy and thermodynamics. Initially, I could perfectly recite the textbook definition on command, Entropy is fundamentally a measure of the degree of disorder present within a system. I could effortlessly write out the necessary mathematical equations on a chalkboard, easily manipulate their variables, and swiftly solve the assigned homework problems. But then, one random afternoon, an acquaintance challenged me to explain the concept of entropy without relying on a single technical term, and I was completely paralyzed. I desperately tried to formulate an answer, but the words that tumbled out of my mouth were absolute, incoherent gibberish. That exact moment of public failure was exactly when I realized I didn't truly grasp the concept at all. So I immediately retreated to my desk and forced myself to think about the universe entirely differently. I began visualizing a single, concentrated drop of dark blue ink plunging into a clear glass of water and slowly, inevitably spreading outward. I thought deeply about the state of a highly disorganized, messy office desk, and the universe's natural, unyielding tendency for organized things to slowly spread out and become mixed up over time. I intensely visualized a solid cube of ice slowly melting away inside a glass of room-temperature water. I asked myself, why does the thermal exchange always travel in that specific direction? Why doesn't the surrounding water spontaneously freeze solid while the isolated ice cube simultaneously grows scorching hot? I began to contemplate the profound relationship between raw information and absolute certainty. What does it genuinely mean for a physical system to be perfectly ordered? Well, if I manage to trap all the bouncing molecules of a specific gas entirely into one tiny corner of a room, I possess the exact knowledge of where they are located. That knowledge is raw information. But the moment those molecules are released and allowed to spread chaotically throughout the entire room, I have permanently lost that specific information. Thus, the overall entropy of the system has exponentially increased. By relentlessly working through these mental exercises, I gradually, painstakingly built up a highly authentic understanding of the concept that did not rely whatsoever on a memorized mathematical formula. Following that mental breakthrough, I never once had to consciously try to remember what entropy meant ever again. I simply knew it, but more profoundly than that, I could literally feel it. I gained the ability to casually glance at absolutely any physical system in the world and instantly possess a deep, accurate intuition regarding precisely what would inevitably happen to its internal entropy. This was not because I had rotely memorized a list of academic rules, but entirely because I had finally understood the foundational principle itself. This foundational truth is exactly why the act of teaching is, without a doubt, such an incredibly powerful, unparalleled tool for personal learning. Whenever you actively attempt to teach a concept to another human being, you are aggressively forced to confront the hidden gaps present within your own mental framework. The incredibly innocent, often incredibly simple questions that other people ask you instantly illuminate the exact areas where you have been secretly relying on frail memorization rather than robust understanding. I can state with absolute certainty that I have learned significantly more about the field of physics simply by attempting to teach it to others than I ever learned by silently sitting in a library studying it alone. Every single time, a curious student raised their hand and asked me why, instead of merely asking what, I was forced into a corner. I had to either genuinely know the fundamental answer, or I had to swallow my pride and openly admit that I didn't have a clue. And I quickly discovered that openly admitting my own ignorance was very often the essential first step toward truly learning the concept. I spent many years of my life teaching introductory physics courses, and without fail, every single semester, at least one student would pose a completely unexpected question that would completely stop me dead in my tracks. They were usually remarkably simple inquiries. Why exactly does a significantly heavier object not fall to the earth at a faster rate? Why exactly does the sky appear blue to our eyes? What actually, fundamentally, is energy? And standing there, I would suddenly realize that I had spent years casually tossing around these specific vocabulary words, effortlessly manipulating these broad concepts in the complex equations. Yet I had never truly paused to think deeply about the foundational, elemental questions they were currently asking me. Those uncomfortable moments of hesitation were absolute gifts in disguise. They forcefully compelled me to return to the drawing board, to think significantly more carefully about the world, and to painstakingly construct a much stronger, much more foundational understanding of the universe. I vividly recall one specific student, a very quiet, observant young girl who always sat in the very back row of the lecture hall, who raised her hand and asked me precisely why physicists utilize entirely different mathematical formulas to calculate momentum in the realm of relativity compared to the traditional realm of classical mechanics. I confidently opened my mouth and immediately began to feed her the standard textbook explanation detailing exactly how mathematical equations physically warp and change at incredibly high velocities. But she bravely interrupted my lecture. "No," she stated firmly. "I mean, why? What is fundamentally, conceptually different?" And in that exact second, it dawned on me that I had been diligently teaching my students the empty mathematical formulas without ever successfully conveying the underlying philosophical insight. Consequently, I paused and started entirely over from scratch. I began discussing exactly how our standard, everyday human intuition regarding the simple addition of moving velocities completely breaks down and fails at the cosmic scale. I passionately explained what it genuinely means for the absolute speed of light to remain perfectly constant for every single observer in the universe, regardless of their own motion. I broke down exactly how the entire concept of momentum absolutely had to be entirely redefined from the ground up just to preserve the fundamental laws of conservation when these incredibly bizarre, relativistic phenomena start occurring. By the time the lecture concluded, I honestly understood the theory of relativity significantly better than I ever had before she bravely asked me that exact question. Over the years, I gradually discovered another profound truth. Although it admittedly took me decades to finally figure out how to articulate it properly, true understanding is absolutely not a final destination. It is a continuous, never-ending process. You do not simply learn a complex concept one single time and then dust off your hands and declare yourself finished. You must repeatedly return to that exact same concept over and over again. And, with each subsequent visit, you approach the idea from an entirely new, fresh angle. And consequently, you understand it just a little bit more deeply than you did the time before. I can guarantee you that I must have studied and relearned classical mechanics, Newton's fundamental laws of motion, and all the associated theories, at least a dozen separate times throughout my lifetime. I learned it initially back in high school. I tackled it again as an undergraduate in college. I dove into it once more during my grueling graduate school years. I confronted it yet again when I was tasked with teaching it. And then, I revisited it countless more times whenever I was required to explain it during the public lectures or write extensively about it. And without fail, every single time I revisited the topic, I discovered something entirely new. I wasn't discovering newly invented facts. The fundamental laws of motion certainly haven't changed. But I was uncovering entirely new layers of understanding, forging brand new mental connections, and discovering entirely fresh ways of visualizing exactly why the physical universe had to operate in that specific manner. The very first time I was introduced to Newton's second law of motion, the famous equation stating that force equals mass times acceleration, I simply memorized the symbols. It was nothing more than a convenient mathematical tool you plugged numbers into to solve homework problems. The second time I encountered it, my brain finally registered it as the literal, fundamental definition of what physical force actually is. The third time I journeyed through the material, I suddenly perceived the hidden, elegant way it deeply connected to the universal conservation of momentum. By the fourth time I studied it, a massive light bulb went off, and I realized the equation was fundamentally a profound philosophical statement regarding exactly how physical systems inevitably respond to external constraints. Every single new layer of deep comprehension actively made all of the previously established layers infinitely richer and more complex. And the most beautiful part is that absolutely none of this rigorous process required even an ounce of rote memorization, because every single new revelation was solidly built upon the bedrock of a genuine, authentic comprehension of whatever had come before it. This specific realization brings me to what is perhaps the single most vital piece of advice I can possibly share with you regarding the concept of human memory, the natural act of forgetting information, followed by the grueling process of actively relearning it, is absolutely not a sign of intellectual failure. In fact, it is the exact method of true mastery. Every single time you are forced to mentally reconstruct a complex idea from the foundational pieces you still understand, you are actively physically strengthening those neural connections within your brain. You are making the invisible, underlying pattern significantly clearer to your mind's eye. You are slowly revealing more and more of the overarching structural architecture. I used to obsessively work through the exact same physics problems over and over again. I didn't do this because I had forgotten how to arrive at the solution, but simply because each separate time I journeyed through the logic, I would inevitably notice some fascinating detail that I had completely missed the previous time. Perhaps I would suddenly realize that the specific equation I was manipulating shared the exact same structural geometry as a completely different equation located in an entirely unrelated branch of physics. Or perhaps I would finally grasp that the underlying reason a highly specific mathematical step actually functioned was deeply tethered to some massively profound universal principle. Let me be perfectly clear. These types of massive intellectual breakthroughs absolutely do not stem from flashcards or memorization. They are born exclusively from the act of doing, from the joy of playing, and from the deep, uninterrupted focus of pure thinking. I recall one specific glorious summer where I dedicated my entire existence simply to playing around with the problems of special relativity. I would sit for hours and invent elaborate imaginary scenarios in my mind. I visualized a high-speed locomotive roaring past a stationary platform. I imagined beams of pure light ricocheting back and forth between moving mirrors. I pictured identical twins embarking on massive journeys across the cosmos at light speed. And then, I would painstakingly work out exactly what each completely different observer in those scenarios would physically witness. I wasn't doing this to prepare for some impending academic exam. I wasn't doing it for any tangible, practical engineering purpose. I did it solely because I harbored a burning, insatiable desire to truly, deeply feel exactly how the mechanics of relativity actually operated in the universe. And by the time that particular summer drew to a close, relativity was no longer just some abstract theory I had learned about in a textbook. It had transformed into a universe that I mentally lived and breathed in. I possessed the remarkable ability to simply close my eyes and vividly visualize complex cosmic events occurring within the fabric of space-time. I could clearly mentally picture exactly how drastically different observers would physically slice up that precise space-time continuum into their own entirely unique, subjective perceptions of space and time. You fundamentally cannot utilize flashcards to memorize that specific caliber of profound intuition. You can only painstakingly build it from the ground up. You know, there is a profound, almost childlike joy hidden within this specific approach to learning that I deeply fear we are rapidly losing due to our modern society's absolute, relentless obsession with pure efficiency. We live in a world where everyone desperately wants to cram a concept into their head just once, rapidly check off the requirement box, and immediately sprint toward the next objective. But genuine, lasting understanding is inherently playful. It is deeply driven by unquenchable curiosity. It possesses the patience and willingness to happily burn away an entire Tuesday afternoon, simply pondering the exact reasons why the world operates the way it does. You don't do it because a teacher is going to test you on it. You do it purely because the universe is endlessly, breathtakingly interesting. I clearly recall relaxing in my backyard on a warm summer afternoon, lazily watching a stream of water naturally spiral down a circular drain, and subsequently dedicating a full, uninterrupted hour entirely to contemplating precisely why the water naturally chooses to spiral in that specific manner. Now, I already possessed the academic answer. I was thoroughly well versed in the mathematics of angular momentum, the complexities of the Coriolis effect, and all the associated physics. But I desperately wanted to truly feel the mechanics of it. I wanted to vividly witness the microscopic forces in my mind's eye. I wanted to deeply comprehend the entire process strictly from the perspective of the water droplets themselves. Was doing that an ultimate waste of precious time? If you evaluate it purely in terms of capitalist productivity metrics, then perhaps it was. However, I can guarantee you that single hour of quiet, deep thinking likely did infinitely more to solidify my genuine understanding of advanced fluid dynamics than an entire grueling week of mindlessly scanning textbooks ever could have accomplished. Or consider the times I would sit and watch my young children happily playing on the playground swing set, and I would find my brain obsessively analyzing the mechanics of pendulums. I wasn't running the mathematical equations in my head. I had already memorized those years ago. I was hunting for the pure physical intuition. Why exactly does applying a physical push at one incredibly specific, precise millisecond cause them to soar exponentially higher into the air? What exact mechanics are occurring during that instantaneous transfer of kinetic energy? How does the physical swing system inherently know what its own natural resonant frequency is supposed to be? I would physically push their swings, physically feel the rhythmic resistance in my arms, deeply contemplate the nature of resonance, and suddenly, out of nowhere, I would genuinely grasp a profound truth regarding oscillating physical systems that I had entirely failed to absorb from years of reading academic literature. This precise dynamic is exactly what I am referring to when I claim that I do not remember things in the traditional sense. I absolutely do not possess neat little rows of mental filing cabinets stuffed with index cards. Instead, I possess this vast, expansive, interconnected landscape of deep understanding residing within my mind. And whenever I find that I require a specific piece of information, I simply organically navigate my way through that mental terrain. I actively reconstruct the required idea, utilizing the foundational principles I already deeply know, relying heavily on the familiar patterns I have witnessed countless times before, and tracing the logical connections that inherently make rational sense to me. And here is the truly beautiful, magical part of this system. Once you successfully construct this specific caliber of deep understanding, it becomes almost completely impossible for you to forget it. This is not because you are expending massive amounts of mental energy desperately trying to hold on to the facts, but purely because those facts have become seamlessly, permanently woven into the very fabric of exactly how your brain processes reality. In order to forget the information, you would literally have to teach yourself how to unlearn spotting patterns, how to stop making logical connections, and how to entirely cease thinking critically. And that is simply not something a human being can consciously forget how to do. I suppose, when you really boil it down to its absolute essence, what I am currently attempting to describe is the fundamental, massive divide that separates mere knowledge from genuine wisdom. I admit, those are somewhat grandiose, lofty terms, but they apply perfectly here. Knowledge is simply possessing the correct factual answer stockpiled somewhere in your brain. Wisdom, conversely, is possessing the dynamic capability to organically figure out what the correct answer must be exactly when the situation demands it. Knowledge is rotely remembering the textbook formula that force equals mass times acceleration. Wisdom is quietly observing a young child swinging on a playground and profoundly, intuitively understanding precisely why delivering a push at the exact, perfect millisecond propels them higher into the sky. And I must be honest with you, the pathway leading to this specific caliber of wisdom is absolutely not fast. It is far from efficient. It does not neatly conform to a standardized university syllabus, and it looks terrible on a rigid corporate study plan. It is an incredibly messy, highly personal, and frequently infuriatingly frustrating process. But, crucially, it is also beautifully permanent. It belongs entirely to you in a profound way that rotely memorized trivia facts never, ever will. I often find myself contemplating the stark difference between authentically learning to play a complex piece of music versus merely memorizing it mechanically. You can easily train yourself to memorize the sequential notes on a page. You can rigidly instruct yourself, place this finger precisely here, move that finger directly there, execute this specific tempo, apply that specific volume dynamic. But the fatal flaw is that if you happen to slip up and lose your exact place in the sequence, you are completely, helplessly lost. Your only recourse is to completely stop the performance and start entirely over from the very beginning, or frantically search for some previously memorized anchor point to jump back in. But imagine if, instead, you actively took the time to genuinely understand the very soul of the music. If you deeply grasped the underlying harmony, the sweeping melody, the architectural structure of the composition, and the intended emotional arc of the piece. If you possess that level of understanding, you can never truly become lost. You inherently know exactly where you are in the song simply because you can feel where you are. And if you happen to strike a wrong chord or make a minor mistake, you possess the capacity to flawlessly improvise, dynamically adapt in real time, and organically navigate your way right back to the main melody. You are no longer merely executing a robotic, memorized sequence of physical steps. You are actively, dynamically creating something beautiful that you intimately understand. That exact dynamic is precisely how I desire to know absolutely everything in this world. I don't want to know things as a sterile sequence of instructions to be blindly executed. I want to know them as a robust, fully realized structure that I understand deeply enough to comfortably improvise within, to seamlessly adapt to entirely new circumstances, and to vividly examine from 1,000 different vantage points. Therefore, if you are currently embarking on a journey to learn something new, and I mean truly, deeply learn it to your core, not merely scrape by to pass a standardized examination, here is my ultimate piece of advice to you. Slow yourself down. Do not sprint desperately toward rote memorization. Instead, obsessively ask yourself why. Ask exactly where the concept originated from. Make a relentless attempt to explain the idea to yourself utilizing the absolute simplest, most basic terms your vocabulary can muster. Play around with the concept. Mentally turn it upside down and inside out. Aggressively connect it to entirely different subjects that you already firmly understand. And when the inevitable day arrives where you do eventually forget a piece of it because human nature dictates that you absolutely will forget, do not panic or become discouraged. Simply go right back to the beginning and methodically rebuild it from scratch. Every single time you undergo that rebuilding process, you are not merely refreshing your memory, you are actively, exponentially deepening your foundational understanding. Invent your own completely unique examples. Do not simply robotically solve the generic practice problems printed at the back of the textbook chapter. Actively invent incredibly difficult, customized problems specifically to challenge yourself. Constantly ask yourself probing what-if questions. What exactly would occur if this specific mathematical parameter was significantly larger? What would physically happen if that particular gravitational force was entirely reversed? What would the final outcome be if I completely eliminated this foundational assumption? Every single one of those exploratory questions pulls you significantly deeper into the foundational architecture of whatever subject you are attempting to master. Furthermore, you must practice extreme patience with yourself. Genuine understanding requires a significant investment of time. It is absolutely not a linear trajectory. There will be highly frustrating days where you will genuinely feel as though you are spinning your wheels and getting absolutely nowhere. And then, completely suddenly, perhaps while you are taking a warm shower or enjoying a quiet evening walk, something hidden within your brain will mysteriously click into place, and you will instantaneously view the entire concept in a completely different, perfectly clear light. That phenomenon is not some mystical, magical moment of divine inspiration. It is simply your incredibly powerful brain working tirelessly in the background, forging hidden neural connections, and diligently sorting out the complex patterns while you weren't looking. You must learn to trust that invisible process. There is a profound, beautiful sense of humility embedded deeply within this specific approach to learning. I firmly believe it requires the courage to openly admit to yourself that you do not genuinely know a subject merely because you can flawlessly recite its dictionary definition. It demands the immense vulnerability required to look someone in the eye and honestly state, I truly do not understand this concept yet, rather than desperately pretending that you do to protect your ego. But concurrently, it requires an immense, unwavering trust, a deep trust that if you simply dedicate the necessary blood, sweat, and tears required to authentically understand the material, the superficial act of remembering it will effortlessly take care of itself. I have dedicated the absolute entirety of my life to the relentless pursuit of learning new things. And the older and more experienced I become, the more intensely I realize just how astonishingly little I actually truly know about this vast universe. But the crucial caveat is this: the incredibly small fraction of things that I do know, I genuinely fiercely know to my absolute core. This is not because I was gifted with some supernatural photographic memory, but entirely because I painstakingly constructed every single building block of that understanding with my own two hands. I carefully connected each new revelation to absolutely everything else I already knew, relentlessly working until that newly acquired knowledge fundamentally transformed into an inseparable part of exactly how I perceive the physical world. And ultimately, when all is said and done, that profound transformation is exactly what makes the entire grueling process so incredibly worthwhile. It isn't about hoarding a massive mental encyclopedia of random trivia facts that you can rapidly recite. It is about the profound, beautiful way that true understanding fundamentally alters exactly how your eyes see the universe. When you genuinely, authentically understand a concept, the entire world around you instantly becomes infinitely richer and more vibrant. You begin to spot incredible hidden patterns that you had remained entirely blind to before. You effortlessly forge brilliant, innovative connections that you previously lacked the capacity to even imagine. Absolutely everything around you becomes infinitely more fascinating, simply because you possess a vastly expanded toolkit of unique ways to think about it. That is the grand hidden secret formula, if there even is one. Do not waste your precious energy desperately trying to remember facts. Dedicate your soul to trying to understand them. The rest of the process follows completely naturally, precisely like gravity pulling water effortlessly down a hillside. And I assure you, that is absolutely not some cheap psychological trick or a trendy productivity hack. It is simply the beautiful, natural way the human mind is designed to function when you finally get out of its way and allow it to do exactly what it does best, actively hunting for profound meaning, forging brilliant connections, and illuminating the breathtaking patterns hidden deep within the beautiful complexity of the universe. So, the very next time you find yourself aggressively attempting to learn a difficult new subject, and you inevitably feel that familiar, desperate urge to simply memorize the text, to violently drill the raw data into your skull through hours of mindless robotic repetition, I implore you to immediately stop. Take a deep, calming breath. Pause and honestly ask yourself, do I truly, genuinely understand exactly where this information originates from? Do I possess the capability to explain it simply and clearly to a complete novice? Does this specific concept logically connect to absolutely anything else that I already know to be true? Give yourself the ultimate permission to proceed slowly, to be meticulously thorough, and to dedicate the time to truly, deeply think. I promise you, your future self, the wiser version of you who still flawlessly understands this exact concept many decades from now, will absolutely thank you for it.